5.
Hello, and welcome to Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. We're happy to be in the studio this week, and as usual, we're happy that you're listening. Hopefully everyone is doing okay, muddling through all of this quarantine stuff, and we hope nobody is going too crazy. But if you are, we can help you with that.
Join us.
Just sit back and catch up on all the weird stories we have going on here, and maybe it'll help a little bit. Just kidding. It probably won't help you avoid going crazy, but maybe provide a bit of entertainment for a while. So with that, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our show so you can be updated every week when we put out a new episode. And if you really want to help us out, it would be really super awesome if you could just take a few seconds and leave us a rating and a review on whichever podcast platform that you happen to be listening from. And don't forget to tell a friend. If you know someone who might be interested in the show, let them know that Bigfoot for Breakfast is out there. We honestly do appreciate it. If you won a contest in the past couple of months, we have been a little slow getting some of the merchandise, but we have it now and it has been shipped to you, so you should be receiving it shortly.
If you want to contact us for any reason, if you have show suggestions or just want to say, hey girl, hey.
Hey girl, hey.
You can email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, shoot us a Facebook message, or you can call us at 641-812-2635. And don't worry, you won't get stuck in an awkward conversation with either one of us because it's just a voicemail system. And if you leave one of those, we will play it on our next episode or eventually on an episode.
Speaking of that, we did just notice that we had a voicemail sitting in our mailbox, so we'll play that right now.
So every time you say phenomena, in my head, all I hear is phenomena. Then I get that song stuck in my head, but I enjoy it, so thank you. Phenomena.
Phenomena. Do, 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 do. We also want to take a few minutes to let you in on some recommendations that we have for some other shows. We know a few that may pique your interest. The Question Everything guys, Semperfi Rob, Sean, and the Mick host a show where they pick a different topic every week that usually seems to coincide with issues that we seem to be facing at the time as American people, and they discuss it. They usually do a Facebook Live every Saturday, and then they'll post the edited version to the podcast platforms a few days later. They also take call-ins from guests who have anything to say regarding the topic that week. So if you can relate in some way or have an opinion, get on their Facebook Live and give them a call and chat them up for a while.
MWP is another show that you guys should check out. Chach and Josh are funny and their conversations flow really well. They talk a lot about movies, wrestling, politics, whatever else comes up through the episode with a lot of jokes and a lot of great personality. So check them out. You won't regret it.
The Kensington Corner with Tom and Jeff is another great show. They tackle the problems of the world one thing at a time, but they focus a lot on health and overall well-being, both mentally and physically, from a man's standpoint. And we found their show to be really interesting because they aren't afraid to really get into the everyday struggles that guys face, especially with mental health and stress. It's a really honest show, and one of them is a veteran, so they promote various causes associated with the mental health of veterans as well, which we think is incredible because it's a very important topic and our nation's veterans don't get the love and support that they deserve. Any conversation that can be had about how to improve that is fantastic.
But forget all that for now, because we're going to tell you a little story. We've got another weird one for you this week, and I have to admit that this is something that I had never heard of until just recently, and I really couldn't believe that it wasn't more of a widespread story than it seems to be. I don't know, maybe all of you guys have heard it before, and I've just been living under a rock this whole time, but I don't really think so.
That's possible.
It is a little bit possible. I read an article, checked into the details of the story, and although it's a super sad story, I also found it to be incredibly interesting. So we thought we should share it with all of you lovely people, and hopefully you will find it as interesting as we did.
Let me get into storytelling mode.
Get your Dan Rather voice going.
One fine day. That's more like...
I was going to say that is not start.
That's the way the cookie crumbles.
Get like Keith Morrison. Don't you watch Dateline?
That's like really... I don't know if I can do that. Oh.
That was close.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt has this app. I don't remember what it's called now, dang it. I wish I could remember it because it's really awesome. But he has clips where he wants people to do like voice acting. He's like, here's the sentence. I want you to say it like in 3 different ways or whatever. And then it's promoting local art and artists and all this stuff. It's really cool. I just downloaded it for a little person that I know that likes to do voice acting.
Yeah, that's good.
But yeah, anyway, it's really cool. That's the way the cookie crumbles. Anyway, I keep saying anyway. Back in the 1940s, the United States found itself pulled into a war that we really didn't ask for or want. This was a time in which patriotism ran high, and young men were quick to jump to the aid of our country and our allies, enlisting in the armed forces and heading into battle. Now, it's fairly safe to say that we could tell you a million horror stories and terrible situations that came from the years in which the entire world seemed to be ablaze with hate during World War II. It was a very dark time. Very dark times.
It really was a dark time.
It really was.
It was horrible.
Like, you can't even joke about it. But for today, we've chosen one story in particular, because this one involves an American that we all know of. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about the late former president of the United States of America, Mr. George Herbert Walker Bush, and the horrific tale of what has come to be known as the Chichi Jima incident. Chichi Jima. Chichi Jima.
Chichi Jima.
Chichi Jima.
Good God.
Mana.
Just so you know, we're not trying to give you a straight up history lesson here, but in order to give you the big picture, we must paint the big picture for those who don't know the timeline and events of World War II.
Millennials.
So bear with us. We will get to the story.
Don't judge me. I'm also a millennial, so I can say mean things about millennials.
We're not that kind of millennial.
Mana. Okay, so let's break it down real quick. Break it down. Wicka wicka wah, and set the scene.
Yes, let's.
In 1939, there were some big things happening and they were moving fast. 2 major world leaders, Adolf Hitler of Germany and Joseph Stalin of Russia, had signed a non-aggression pact that made the rest of the world pretty nervous in the midst of impending conflict. And for good reason.
Yeah, y'all know, right?
Y'all know. Since only a few short weeks later, Hitler would sail on in to invade Poland, as he had been threatening and planning to do for a while. And since Poland, I keep saying Poland, has been under the support of Great Britain and France, they felt compelled to declare war on Germany in return, igniting the start of World War II. Not long after this, Russia moved in on Poland from the other side, and both countries split control of the nation.
German and British navies were fighting at sea, with the German U-boats taking the lead and sinking British vessels like crazy. Only 7 months later, in 1940, Germany took Norway and Denmark, and then a few weeks after that, Belgium and the Netherlands.
The Netherlands.
But he didn't stop there. With the help of Italian leader Mussolini, Hitler's forces swept into France, taking most of it and reducing the country to near collapse. And then he went right after Great Britain with Operation Sea Lion.
Sea lions are really aggressive.
They're kind of mean.
And they stink.
They're so cute, but
They're not. Yeah, no, they're mean. I encountered some in a cave in California on a kayak.
Their whiskers freak me out. So much.
No, they're just mermaid dogs.
They really are.
They really are mermaid dogs.
They're cute again now.
What was that? So Britain took a hard hit, but they put up a great fight, defeating the German Air Force even after heavy night raids and bombings caused tons of human casualties and damage to the British infrastructure. This is where America comes in.
Kind of.
We
come in a little bit. Just the tip.
God damn it. You son of a bitch, I'm in.
You piece of shit.
You piece of shit. Anyway, so for the most part, we had remained neutral, but had been engaged under what is called the Lend-Lease Act. This act gave our country the right to lend or lease supplies during a time of war to any nation that we thought was important to our defense. Great Britain was an ally, so if she fell, it could directly impact our well-being. They were basically standing alone here against Germany while being attacked from every direction, and they were struggling. So when British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked for help, we gave it. America. Although it was a hotly debated situation within the U.S. government, we ended up sending ships, guns, ammo, food, aircraft, tanks, clothing, building material, and whatever else we could to Great Britain, and then soon after that to China and to the Soviet Union as well. President Roosevelt felt that this would ensure the defeat of Nazi Germany without having to directly enter the war, because while Germany had been planning this for years and had been building itself up for this war, we were not prepared for it. But, although quietly, the United States was preparing.
The setback of not having...
You better leave that noise in.
I might.
Yeah. I wish you could see the face that she makes when she makes that noise.
I feel like the cowardly lion.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah,
Bye, we're king.
That's it. It's very throaty.
I don't know. I find it very nasally. Less throaty and more. Yeah.
It's throaty.
Yeah.
The step back of not having yet conquered Great Britain did not slow Hitler's roll, though. He soon went on to take Yugoslavia and Greece in 1942, and then he set his sights on the Soviet Union. He's really like on a roll.
Slow your roll, Hitler.
Running right along.
Stay in your lane.
But just before he did that, their allies in Japan decided on a surprise attack on U.S. soil, and they hit us hard and unexpectedly when they laid siege on our naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1942, killing just over 2,300 troops when they did it. And we weren't even in the war, and they just bombed us.
It was a problem.
If the U.S. hadn't decided to become fully involved before, they sure as hell were now. And the dust from the explosions had barely settled when the United States declared war on Japan the very next day.
But we are not here to give you an entire history lesson on World War II, but we do have to lay the stage.
Yep.
So in the following next couple of years, the U.S. saw its share of combat, including the Battle of Midway, our troops storming the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, and joining our British allies at the Battle of the Bulge. And as you can imagine, the attack on our harbor and successes in battle after we were officially sparked some of the fiercest feelings of patriotism that America has ever seen, especially in one particular young man. He was a senior in high school when U.S. involvement was declared, and if he had been able to, he would have enlisted immediately. He wasn't quite 18 years old, and because he wanted to fight so badly, he considered enlistment in the Canadian Royal Air Force. His draw to the Navy's pilot program was his setback. He wanted to be a part of the United States Navy so badly that he decided to wait it out, and just after his 18th birthday, he set off for Boston to start his servitude, and it's speculated that this man was the Navy's youngest flying officer when he earned his wings just before he turned 19 years old. This young man was future United States President George Herbert Walker Bush, and what he was about to face would change his life forever. Not only that, but as much horror as he experienced during this time as a Navy flyboy, he wouldn't even know the full extent of it until decades later.
Have you ever heard this story?
Bits and pieces, but not in its entirety.
It is
so this is a history lesson for me as well.
It's a crazy story. I was thinking about it while I was writing earlier about how this is just one story. But oh my gosh, World War II was, so many people have stories like this and how much it affected them. Because in this story, as bad as it is, and it is really bad, we don't even get into touching like Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
This is just one little tiny piece. It's just crazy. So since Pearl Harbor is such an important element here, and the Japanese are the ones who bombed us, and coincidentally are super involved in this specific story that we are getting into, let's give them a bit of background, so that it's a little easier to understand how things happen the way they do. Keep in mind that Japan is not a big country. I think I read somewhere that at the time they started, they were like the size of California. The Japanese people have had to really fight to keep what they have. Their land, their culture, their beliefs, everything they know intact. So if you think about it, they're a tiny little country surrounded by huge countries. So they're really lucky that they were never just taken over. But they weren't. In less than 100 years, they've gone from being virtually unknown to being a major world power because they had the intense and undying will to simply exist as they are. In their past wars, the samurai soldier has been portrayed with honor because that's what they stood for. They were incredibly disciplined, honorable, physically and spiritually clean, focused, and fair, fighting and 100% willing to give their life for their country that they loved and cherished deeply. They considered this to be an honor, and they were not afraid of it.
Just to start, this is not meant to be some racial outcry against the Japanese people. This is just the history of it. This does not mean that the Japanese people all were or are the way that they were portrayed during World War II. World leaders across the globe had big agendas during this time and went to great hateful and sadistic lengths to accomplish their goals. And right along with the others, the Imperial Japanese Army went through somewhat of a dark phase during World War II and had a new twist to it. They were just smaller and had something to prove. Kids who had been raised with the honorable stories of the samurai imprinted on them from an early age, were now being systematically molded during school, harshly and horribly, into something a bit terrifying. So they were being taught this way of life. They were taught this way of thinking. This is our country. We are the best. And the only honorable thing to do is to die for your country, pretty much. They were taught to be soldiers.
They even had the military personnel come in and start teaching their PE classes, teaching them to systematically march and just making them into basically perfect child soldiers.
When they reached the age where they could be enlisted, this was beaten into them even harder. They were beaten terribly daily for any tiny little mistake that they made. If the officers didn't like their salute, they didn't snap to attention at the mention of the emperor's name quickly enough, they were beaten. The officers were sadistic, and I don't make that accusation lightly. Broken bones, disfigurements, busted teeth, internal injuries, these things were completely common just in a day of training. And then they were expected to get back to work perfectly, I might add, or they were beaten even harder.
Before the war, the Japanese terrain was overpopulated and mountainous, so many of them were impoverished and starving. Basically, the population was too big for the amount of food they could grow on the island. The people had zero voice in the government, and they lived by an oppressive, uncaring government backed by a fearsome army with no mercy. Political violence was rampant, with leaders being executed and assassinated horribly through the 30s. When the war started, every man aged 17 to 40 was subject to obligatory service for 3 years or more.
In this environment, the soldiers were also brainwashed. The army would pay them a meager wage that was better than what they were getting as farmers, so they took these already poor, beaten down by life people and beat them into hardened, sacrificial warriors. They were taught to terrorize other people and to love cruelty and torture, seeing the slaughter of an enemy target as a great honor and duty. Also, that any orders from the emperor are orders from God, because the domination of the Pacific was the divine order. The Japanese soldier training saw a major shift from disciplined and impeccably trained to forcibly indoctrinated. By the time World War II came around, they were taught that they would die, no matter what. They were expected to take any orders from the officers and execute them without question. As the war went on, and these men were left starving at their posts with extreme shortages in resources and medicine, their tactics became even more sacrificial than before. They would die before surrendering because that was honorable, and they would take out anyone that they could take with them. Torture and murder were absolutely routine and expected. They used POWs as target practice, enslaved unwilling girls to serve as comfort women, performed horrible medical experiments on prisoners, and that's just the short list.
In an interview with CBS News, James Bradley, author of a book called Flyboys about World War II airmen, he stated, World War II flyboys were the first to engage in combat aviation in large numbers. In bomber jackets, posing with their thumbs up, they epitomized masculine glamour. They were cool and they knew it, and any earthbound fool had to know it too. They flew the original Missions Impossible. Climbing into 1940s era tin cans with bombs strapped below their feet, they hurtled off carrier decks into howling winds or took off from island airfields. Flyboys would wing toward distant targets, dive into flak shots from huge guns, and drop their lethal payloads. With their hearts in their throats, adrenaline pumping through veins, the flyboys then had to dead reckon their way back to a tiny speck of landing deck or to a distant airfield their often damaged planes never made it to.
I feel like we should be clear here. I mean, while it wasn't like the extent of brainwashing, I mean, they obviously were.
It was the extent of brainwashing.
I mean, for American soldiers. I mean, It was the same.
Yeah, it really went both ways because as I was researching this, there was a lot of old videos of anti-Japanese propaganda that were being played throughout America, and it was extremely hateful. They were taught the Japanese were totally evil, hateful, horrible people, which they were kind of being trained to be, but I mean, the hatefulness went both ways.
And even, I mean, innocent Japanese American families were put in internment camps as well in America.
Exactly.
It went both ways. I don't want to sound
No,
biased.
And that's why we kind of talked about at the beginning. The world leaders of the time were all screwed up, almost in every single part of the globe. So the whole world was just full of this hate constantly, and it caused a lot of problems. So that's what I meant by we're not going to make this some anti-Japanese racial situation, because that's not really what this is about. This is literally just a piece of history that we're talking about. And I mean, we could talk about Nazi Germany the same way, or America in a lot of ways the same way during the time.
Of the Japanese perspective regarding the Flyboys, Bradley said, quote, "And while America cheered its flyers as its best and brightest, the Japanese had a very different view of those who wreaked havoc from the skies. To them, airmen who dropped napalm on defenseless civilians living in paper houses were the non-human devils," which is fair from that perspective.
The United States had employed strategy against Japan during the war that seemed to be working well. They called it island hopping. They would target key islands in the Pacific, capture them, build airstrips, and load the island with B-29 bombers. They would also take out Japanese islands that were part of supply chains for the enemy. It was like a game of leapfrog. So if you look at a map of Japan and there's a bunch of tiny little islands clear around it in the Philippines, they would just capture one at a time, getting closer to Japan, basically. They would take control of a tiny island, secure it, and then hop forward to the next one. It was actually a super dangerous job. These islands were heavily defended with entrenched and hidden enemies, and the pilots who were doing this were facing heavy artillery, getting shot down one after another. It was a really unpredictable and challenging gig, and this is exactly what George H.W. Bush signed up for. The Navy airmen were the best of the best, and they knew it. It was like Top Gun. They were Top Gun.
In 1944, a 20-year-old Bush was sent to serve on the Navy Avenger aircraft, the biggest airplane that the Navy could possibly lift off of the shorter airstrips on the ship. I've seen the movie Flyboys. That was a great movie.
It's James Franco.
Yeah.
I only saw that it was a movie today.
I didn't read that book. I read Iwo Jima.
Flags of Our Fathers. That's the one about
yeah.
Iwo Jima. I read parts of Flyboy just here and there in order to do this show, but I didn't get to read the whole book because I didn't have time, but I really do want to go back and read it because James Bradley, he's a good author.
They were dangerous planes. By June, he was involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but just as it really got started, he was back out of it. He left the airstrip of the San Jacinto one day, and just after takeoff, he had to make an emergency landing in the water, crashing his plane into the ocean. Everyone aboard the aircraft survived this, and after it happened, he did get in on a few successes. After this, he was promoted to lieutenant in June of 1944.
I have to say, he named his planes after Barbara, girlfriend at home, who would soon become Barbara Bush, his wife. And by the end of this whole thing, he had a Barbara 3 because he kept crashing his planes. And I was thinking, gosh, he's not very good. But apparently it was super common. Like, they just crashed planes all the time and survived it, which I think is terrifying, but
I think it's a much bigger deal now.
Well, I think those planes were pretty rickety.
Jank, yeah.
Like they were just 1940s kind of getting started making the airplanes, and so they were still kind of trying things out. And these planes were super heavy. I read one article where they said it was the biggest planes the Navy even dared try to lift off a boat. So I think it was hard to do.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I would think they would have to have the bare minimum equipment, to keep the weight down.
Probably.
Anyway.
The island hopping that we were talking about earlier was still going on, and this primarily focused on the Bonin Islands of South Japan and the Philippine Sea. On September 2nd of 1944, just 2 months after his promotion, Bush was assigned to hop in an Avenger aircraft and fly to the tiny island of Chichi Jima. This is where the nightmare begins. There were 3 planes and 9 naval aviators total on the mission. This was Task Force 38. Chichi Jima was a tiny little volcanic island that lay about 640 miles south of Tokyo. And when I say tiny, I mean it. It was only 15 square miles. Airmen knew that this was a very heavily guarded small island, and the men that went on these missions frequently didn't come back.
These bombing missions were pretty common occurrence with the island hopping and targeting important enemy resources from the air. But they didn't only use planes in these missions. They also used submarines, basically having them patrol around the island that they planned to raid and putting them on sort of a lifeguard duty for when planes were shot down on the ocean. These submarines were guided by aviators known as Hellcats.
Have you ever heard of that? The Navy Hellcats?
Yeah. The Hellcat pilots communicated with the submarines, telling them the location of any downed planes in the area so that they could quickly find and rescue any survivors.
And by quickly, I meant like hours. Within a few hours, they would hopefully get there.
Obviously, they didn't save everyone, but just one day prior to the planned bombing on Chichi Jima, a submarine called the USS Finback had rescued 3 naval aviators that had been shot down near Iwo Jima. So, if an airman survived the plane crash, it was possible that he might be rescued into a submarine and come out of it alive. The USS Finback was in the area of Chichi Jima the day that George H.W. Bush went down into the ocean as well.
So here they were, the USS Finback and the Hellcat helpers, patrolling the area checking for zoomies. Zoomies, or what they called crash planes. So they're looking for zoomies when the Hellcat pilots radioed down to the submarine at about 9:30 a.m. that they had one. The submarines, though, they had to stay about 7 miles away from the island and keep their engines off to avoid detection and facing missiles and other artillery being sent their way from shore.
Okay, so now back to George Bush. He's flying his fighter plane and coming up to the island of Chichi Jima, where he and his comrades were ordered to use bombs to take out a radio tower. That's always the story, isn't it? It seems like all the movies get the radio tower.
They don't want them communicating.
I just watched Battleship today, and that was also the mission.
That's a really good movie.
I cried in that movie.
Yeah, it's hard not to.
Well, I know, and it's weird because people make fun of me. Well, at what part do you find...
When the old guys come and do the ship?
Yes, we need to borrow your boat.
It's so awesome. It gets me every time.
It's always the Missouri.
I'm like ugly crying by the end of that movie.
Anyway, the mission was important because the tower was being used by the Japanese to intercept U.S. communications, and then they would alert other enemy forces about what the Americans had planned, especially regarding airstrike targets. The American pilots knew what was coming. It was an island that was heavily guarded by around 25,000 Japanese soldiers and fortified, so they were about to be facing some pretty heavy artillery coming their way. The Japanese men had been desperately fending off American attacks for quite a while now, so they were pretty well prepared.
There were 2 other men in his plane, Ted White and John Delaney. Ted White being on the plane was sort of a twist of ill fate because he had actually come to Bush earlier that day after hearing about the mission and asked if it would be okay if he go on the mission with them, giving the regular gunner a break. They all agreed that this would be just fine, and just like that, Ted White was going. There is a CNN interview with George Bush regarding the Chichi Jima incident, and in this he talks about Ted White and this last-minute decision. Bush said, quote, "I thought that it would be a good adventure for the guy. Get permission from the skipper and you're in, man. He was a friend of mine, a close friend." End quote.
The man Ted White replaced on that mission, Lee Nato, stated that the chief told him to stand down because White had permission. Nato was okay with it. He had to be. But then nobody came back. He said, quote, "It's an eerie feeling to know that a man takes your place and dies in war. The thing that irritated me most was that he wasn't a flying personnel, so he knew nothing about the aircraft. Apparently, he and the other airmen, Delaney, had practiced a jumping procedure many times in which Del would put his chute on and grab Nato's off the wall. Nato would slide down towards Delaney and get his chute. Delaney would jump first, and then Nato would put his chute on and jump after him. In this interview, Nato said, 'That was a procedure we practiced. Now, with a stranger up there in the turret, that procedure is gone out the window.'"
Sure enough, as the gap closed between the planes and Chichi Jima, the 3 planes found themselves in a hail of bullets, and they weren't even quite to the island yet when Lieutenant Bush noticed that his plane was on fire. He kept going, just a little bit further. He made it to his target and he was able to release 4 bombs, hitting the radio tower directly.
Still on fire, he made an immediate curve around the island to head back to the USS San Jacinto. He knew his plane wasn't going to be able to carry him far, but he needed to get as far out from the island as he could. The 3 planes were all heading back and they were all in bad shape. The crew from one plane ejected, and the plane went down. Then the other. His plane was still on fire, and he saw the flames were getting awfully close to the fuel tank, so he was anticipating that it would soon explode. I don't want to explode.
That's kind of where he was at. He's
Name
like,
that movie.
I don't know.
You don't know?
Uh-uh.
There's a small chance that we will hit some turbulence and then explode.
I don't want to explode? Is that what he said?
Yeah, and he said, well, I don't want to Oh, Firefly. Serenity.
No, it's been a long time since that's funny.
It's my sci-fi nerd shout out. Anyway, I don't want to explode. That's one of my favorite things to say ever. He knew that they had to eject, but he couldn't communicate this with the two men behind him in the plane because there was a metal-plated wall between them. Crawling out onto the wing of the plane, he motioned for the other guy sitting directly behind him to get out. They ejected. And with that, George H.W. Bush jumped from the wing of his aircraft into the cold water of the Philippine Sea. On the way down, though, he pulled his ripcord too early and the tail of the plane hit him in the head. In an interview, Bush said that as he fell, he immediately noticed that he was bleeding everywhere.
So,
premature.
Yeah. He, I guess with these planes, the wings are they're hinged and they can go up and down, the back parts of them. So apparently that's where he said the fire was, on both sides of the wings, right in that hinged area. And on those planes, the fuel tank sits just under the wings. There's 2 fuel tanks. So just to give an idea of what they were going through, I guess, and why he thought that they were probably going to be exploding soon.
Explode.
And also, if I got any of this wrong, especially as far as how George Bush got out of the plane and warned his crewmates, it was super unclear in a lot of the interviews and a lot of the articles that I read. So I did the best I could to kind of describe that.
From what she could surmise.
From what I could surmise, that's how it went down. But like I said, it was kind of unclear how it was all set up. And I'm not sure if the metal plate was removable or if he was able to communicate to them. But from what I can understand, he seemed to have climbed out on the wing and kind of just told them. And then he felt hard resistance as the parachute actually got hung up on the tail of the plane. It came loose pretty quick, allowing his fall to continue toward the ocean. But a couple of the panels in his parachute were ripped out now. So although he was slowing down a little, he was falling a lot faster than he should have been, and he hit the water really hard.
So now, Bush managed to bomb his target and get out of his heavily damaged plane, but obviously he wasn't out of the proverbial woods yet. Actually, he was nowhere near the woods. He was floating in the middle of the damn sea with nowhere to go. And the enemy that he had just dropped 4 bombs on, they knew he was there. But he heard another plane. Not long after he'd surfaced, there was an American F-6F Hellcat fighter plane coming in low above him, and they were pointing at something. He started swimming as hard as he could in the direction that they indicated, and lo and behold, right there in front of him was a life raft. I bet that was about the best sight ever.
Yep. Oh no. The next best sight is coming right up. Listen to this.
I don't know.
Crazy.
I almost would have been scared to go at what they're pointing at. Because if somebody's pointing at something when I'm in a bad situation, my initial assumption is that they're saying, look out for that.
Like, go the other way.
Yes.
That's a bad thing.
Run away from that.
Well, that's not what he did, luckily. He went to it, and it was a freaking
I would
life
have been
raft.
swimming away from my life raft.
They would have been so pissed.
Where are you going?
Leave him there, then.
I don't know what to do with my hands.
Yeah.
I can't swim, also.
No, you cannot. He lashed onto the life raft for dear life, but there was still a huge problem. The wind was blowing right back toward Chichi Jima, so not only did he have to hold on for dear life, constantly fighting the waves, he had to swim, and swim really hard. In an interview with George Bush regarding this incident, he said, quote, I swam as fast as I could. I was sick to my stomach. I was scared. I wondered what had happened to my crewmen. And suddenly I saw this periscope, and it looked like a United States submarine in Japanese waters. End quote. So he'd been sitting in the life raft, worrying, crying, panicking, bleeding, puking over the edge, scared for his friends, and suddenly there it was. The black hole of a sub right there in front of him, like a miracle from God, and he thought he was hallucinating. So imagine you're sitting in a life raft and all of a sudden you just see this periscope. I mean, that would be like, oh, you know, thank you, sweet baby Jesus.
It'd be kind of creepy, though, just to see the thing, the periscope.
Well, I'd be scared it wasn't American.
Right.
Am I done?
Surely they mark them.
The periscope part?
Yeah, I would think.
I don't know. Well, he said...
Well, I'm sure in the designs of the ships and everything, they know. You know, they
Yeah.
know.
They know.
And sure enough it was. The USS Finback had been hanging around quietly waiting for any signal when they got notification that there was an airman floating on a raft in the water. The planes overhead flew around him, shooting at Japanese boats as they approached the raft, trying to retrieve the American prisoner. They flew back and forth, keeping the enemy at bay and trying to alert the USS Finback of Bush's location. At one point, the planes even had to leave him floating there alone for a while so that they could refuel on the USS San Jacinto. By the time he was actually rescued, I'm not entirely sure how long he had floated on the raft in the ocean, but I read one report that said 2 hours and then another that said 4. But 4 hours floating in the ocean, not knowing if they were going to make it to you in time or not? Ugh.
I'm sure it was harrowing.
I don't want to be in the ocean at all.
I'm not an ocean fan at all. In a raft, it's okay, just as long as you're not dangling around waiting for a shark.
You can find video of this online of George Bush being pulled from his life raft into the submarine, too, so that's pretty cool. Supposedly, after being fished out of the ocean and pulled onto the ship, the first thing that George Bush said was, "Happy to be aboard."
Hells yes.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
So, that was a heroic-ass rescue right there.
Yeah, it was. And they did that all day long.
And then they, shot down boats and stuff. But that was their secondary mission, I guess, which is kind of patrol. Then, okay, he's in the submarine, and they were kind of looking for people, his other downed crewmates. But they got a call out to this other person that had been shot down. So they had to leave the area and go to this other place. So they go to this other guy, and he's in a life raft, just like George Bush was. But he was closer to the island than what George was. So they couldn't just surface because he was too close. They would just get shot down. So they had to be all creative about it. And I thought this was crazy cool. So they go up to this guy and they just sneak their periscope up right next to him. And they zoom past him real quick, put it down. And then they come back and they sneak their periscope up right beside him. So this guy grabs onto the periscope and they go zooming away while he's in the life raft.
That is so cool.
And they lost him a couple times, so they had to go back and go get him. But I was like, they went to great lengths to get their folks back and save them. But I mean, that's a cool story to tell from World War II.
Yeah. What's that guy's story?
Yeah, it's neat. Anyway.
So he told the crew of the sub that he didn't even see his crewmen's parachutes after he had jumped, and he wondered if they went down with the plane or if they had ended up ejecting too soon and actually landed on the island. The planes and the submarine ended up searching for the missing men for a few hours, but then they got pulled away to another pilot in the raft by the neighboring island.
That's the one I was talking about. In an interview, George says, the USS Finback, they came alongside and picked me up, pulled me onto the deck, and the ship went back down again and started 30 terrifying days as we stayed on war patrol on that submarine on a voyage which won our skipper of the submarine the Silver Star. It was a traumatic experience, but no different than what a lot of kids went through in World War II. And that's the point I want to make, because people talk about, well, you're a hero. There's nothing heroic about doing your duty and doing it with honor. And there's nothing heroic about getting shot down. I've always wondered how they honor you if you get shot down, but if you land your plane safely back on the ship, like you're supposed to, you're just another pilot.
Was that a quote?
Yeah.
George Bush knew that his crewmen hadn't survived the ordeal, but he didn't know the details for sure. It sounds like he thought that one of his men never made it out of the plane and that another one died when he hit the water. There was a pretty great book by James Bradley called Flyboys, which we discussed earlier, regarding the incident. And in 2002 interview with Bradley, Bush actually asked Bradley if he knew what happened to his friends.
So in 2002, George Bush still really didn't know for sure what happened, which I think is terrible.
Especially when one of the guys really
didn't belong there.
I don't want to say he had no business being there, but
It doesn't sound like he did.
Yeah.
While I wasn't able to find what happened precisely to those specific men, it was recorded that over 100 airmen were shot down over or near Chichi Jima, and only 3 of them ever were rescued by the subs and survived their ordeal. One of those incredibly lucky 3 being George H.W. Bush. After Bush spent 30 days aboard the USS Finback submarine, he returned to the USS San Jacinto by choice to finish out his tour, even after they told him that he could go home if he wanted to. At the end of it all, he had flown 58 combat missions during his enlistment. After the war, Bush would be honorably discharged and go on to attend Yale University, become CIA director, hold various other political offices, and eventually would run for and secure the presidency of the United States of America for 1 term.
I was kind of wondering what would have happened if George H.W. Bush had been captured and killed. How different would American history have been?
For real. As far as the captured men, we wouldn't find out what happened to them until later after the island was captured in 1945. The Japanese men on the island were led by Admiral Kanizo Mori and Major General Yoshio Tachibana. On the island, brutal executions of POWs were expected, along with one other thing that was proven to have happened. Evidence would come to show that some of these men were executed by beheading and that their bodies were sent to a surgeon on the island who would then remove a piece of the soldier's liver and his thighs. Later, these pieces would be cooked and consumed at a banquet with vegetables and soy sauce to be held the same night, celebrating their victory. Other people were fully eaten.
We're just taking a moment here
It gets worse.
to soak that in.
Yeah.
So I'm not entirely sure how many men were captured and even how many of those men were eaten exactly, because stories and reports on this vary so widely. I'm sure there's something more accurate somewhere, but we weren't really able to find anything that we were fully confident in when reporting the numbers was concerned. But it seems like there were several. Under the direction of Major General Yoshio Tachibana and Admiral Kanizo Mori, the Japanese men were ordered to commit these atrocities out of the desire for revenge, since the Americans were attacking the island so often by air. Keep in mind also, there was a dire shortage of meat on Chichi Jima, and the Japanese men were nearly starving to death. It was said that they believed that by eating parts of their fallen enemy, they would gain great spiritual and physical strength. Japanese officers on the island knew that this was a huge deal and that they would likely be severely punished for it, so they ended up trying to cover it all up.
A Marine colonel by the name of Presley Rixley would be the man to push hard enough to find the truth. These Marines led by Rixley were on Chichi Jima after the surrender to repatriate and evacuate the Japanese men from the island after the United States had begun to occupy it. The Marines did what they needed to do on the islands, demilitarizing defenses there, and their task had finished up on June 1st of 1946. But one thing still bugged him. What was the fate of all those missing men? It was Rixley who didn't want to let it go. He instigated the investigation to find out and started interviewing lots and lots of Japanese people who had been present on the island. And they were surprisingly talkative. He'd heard rumors from lots of them about incredibly barbaric treatment of the American POWs on the island, but one day, a Japanese Coast Guard cutter carrying a man named Frederick Arthur Savory, a descendant of a man named Nathanial Savory who had been a whaler who had settled in the Bonin Islands long ago, even 100 years before the Japanese surrender. He had talked of hearing stories of cannibalism on Chichi Jima, and they believed it had still been going on. After talking more in depth to soldiers and officers, they came to find out that it was all true. Rixley would later write, "We were flabbergasted at first, and expecting beheadings, of course, but never cannibalism. What manner of men were these?"
We had even found it written somewhere. I'm not really sure where, though. I don't really remember, and I'm not really sure how reliable it is. But for a while, a lot of the soldiers on Chichi Jima weren't really aware that they were eating human flesh. I think they suspected it, but they didn't ask any questions since they'd been starving and were being fed, which is super sad.
The Navy found out what happened here, and trials were held in 1947 regarding war crimes committed by the leaders. The families were never told of what happened to their loved ones in the Pacific. One lawyer involved in the trials would later say in an interview, the Navy didn't want families to know that their sons were eaten. James Bradley, author of Flyboys, True Story of Courage, wrote, quote, "For nearly 5 decades, most people had no idea what happened to them until a large declassification of government documents in 1997 brought their stories to light. Families were still writing to the deceased airmen, and showing up to Washington trying to figure out what happened to them. They were simply given a vague cover story and turned away. They just went on not knowing.
There were other instances in which cannibalism had taken place here as well, since food shortages were making people desperate. James Bradley did an interview about cannibalism within their own ranks, in which a former Japanese soldier told him, quote, "There was absolutely nothing to eat, and we decided to draw lots. The one who lost would be killed and eaten, but the one who lost started to run away, so we shot him. He was eaten. I met some soldiers in the mountains carrying baked human arms and legs. It was not the guerrillas, but our own soldiers that we were frightened of."
When the Japanese surrendered, one American officer was quoted as saying, "Rank upon rank of living scarecrows lined up along the route of the inspecting party. Men with ankles as thin as skinny wrists, with sun-lean cheeks, and with every rib showing sharply."
The way that I read it, this wasn't a countrywide thing, eating people. It seems like it was pretty circumstantial in the mixture of starving to death and the installation of the beliefs and mindset from an early age that they had to do literally anything that they had to do to succeed for their country created the perfect storm for this sort of thing. And that as horrified as the United States was to find out what happened to these men, the Japanese authorities were equally so. This was kept secret on both sides of the pond.
Trials for the war crimes were held in Guam, in which one witness stated that he witnessed an American soldier being forced to kneel by an open grave and then was beheaded. The next day, human flesh was served to the men for dinner. They would come to find this man was a radio operator by the name of Marv Mershon. It was said that when he was struck, he didn't cry out. He only slightly groaned as he died.
A few other specifics also came out, and as far as we can tell, this list may be that of the men who were flying with the squadron with Bush, but we're not really 100% sure on that. And these were the fates of those men after crashing at Chichi Jima.
A man named Floyd Hall was also eaten by the men. His liver was cut into tiny pieces, pierced with bamboo sticks, and served to the officers at a banquet as a delicacy. In testimony by Kunizo Mori, the officer who had ordered this to be done told him, quote, "I had it pierced with bamboo sticks and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables. They ate it in very small pieces. It's good medicine for the stomach." End quote.
A translator named Jimmy Dye was found to be a victim of cannibalism here as well. His liver had also been served to officers after being held prisoner for weeks on Chichi Jima.
Warren Earl Vaughn, an airman, was eaten, and the rest of the men had been simply executed. One of them beaten to death with a club.
It sounds like, on Chichi Jima at least, Admiral Kunizo Mori and Major General Yushio Tachibana were in charge of all of this. These two men, along with some others, were charged as guilty in the trials and sentenced to death by hanging. At the top of a war crime document detailing the results of the trials dated April 11 through July 26 of 1946, it is written, "As of August 1st, 1946, 5 death sentences have been imposed, while 3 of the accused received life imprisonment. 1 was sentenced to 25, 2 to 15, 3 to 10, and 1 to 5 years imprisonment." The document goes on to list all of the men on trial, their crimes, and their sentences. Yushio Tachibana and Kunizo Mori, lead officers on Chichi Jima, were 2 of the men who were hanged in Guam. Some of the others who were involved in the cannibalism of soldiers after their death, but not for killing the soldiers, were charged in the prevention of an honorable burial, because there had never been any protocols written for how to deal with something like this. After the trials, all information about the incident became classified. It was thought that it was just too distressing to release to the families, and it was better that they just not know.
By the time that everything was sorted out and the information became more public, James Bradley said that all of the parents of the airmen had already passed away. He did, however, notify their closest living family members anyway, prior to publishing the book out of respect. Even George Bush was notified because he had never known the fates of these men either. It's said that as Bradley was letting him know what had actually taken place, the former president looked on in silence, shaking his head in disbelief.
And you know how I love my fun facts.
Here comes a fun fact.
We read that people who eat other humans on a regular basis often develop a prion disease called kuru. Anybody ever heard of that? Because I've heard of it. Symptoms were weird in this initially unknown disease. People would first have trouble walking, About a year later, they would be completely unable to move or perform their own daily tasks such as feeding or toileting themselves. The disease is often called the laughing death because they would die while uncontrollably laughing as they lost control over their emotions and their muscles. Because it's not natural. We are naturally made to not eat each other.
No, yep, I agree completely.
Just don't do it.
Granted, they were starving to death, but damn.
What do you do?
I just want to throw out there, if you're wondering how dedicated some of these Japanese soldiers were, there was a guy, this is really off the subject in a way, named Hiru Onoda, and he was an intelligence officer who fought in World War II, and he was actually a Japanese holdout who didn't surrender when the war actually ended and America came and took Japanese people off the islands. He hid in the jungle and actually just kind of kept fighting the war, and he didn't surrender until 1974. So that's some crazy stuff. That's some serious business right there.
That is pretty dedicated. Wasn't there the same thing when we were talking about the Cold War, how there was people that were they were unaware that the war had ended and they were still out just killing people?
Hiding from the Russians in the mountains?
Yeah.
The people who had escaped from the Gulag prisons.
Yeah.
That's what it was. They were still hiding in the mountains. They didn't know that Stalin wasn't the leader anymore. Yeah, some crazy stuff. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. We hope you enjoyed that. And we do hope you'll come back next week for another weird story because we've got them lined up forever.
Forever.
Don't forget to push that subscribe button. And please, if you like the show and you want to help us out, leave us a rating and a review. It helps us a ton, and we really love hearing from you guys. Don't forget that we are having a contest for a free t-shirt or a coffee mug, and all you have to do to get your name in there is recommend us on any social media platform. Just make sure you tag us so that we see it. The more you recommend us, the more you are entered. Alternatively, you can put a picture of yourself on our Bigfoot for Breakfast Facebook page of you Mothmanning. Whatever that means to you, do it, and we'll stick your name in the drawing for a prize. 2 winners will be chosen this month, and if you have something to say and you want to be on the air, leave us a voicemail and we play it on the next episode. All you have to do is call 641-812-2635, and with all that business out of the way, we hope to see you again next week.
And that's the way the cookie crumbles.
That's the rest of the story.
Aw, she brought Paul Harvey into it.
I love Paul Harvey so much.
I miss Paul Harvey.
Me too. Anyway, see you next week.
Come at me, bro.